Heavy, dusty curtains of dark burgundy velvet, separating the inner chambers from the stuffy Roman night, swayed almost imperceptibly. In the room, lit only by the uneven, flickering glow of a few oil lamps, reigned an atmosphere that could hardly be called pious. The air here was thick and stale, permeated not by the scent of incense and wax, as would befit the dwelling of a supreme pontiff, but by the aromas of spilled Falerian wine, oriental incense, and human sweat. Outside the windows, somewhere below, in the labyrinth of the eternal city's narrow streets, night guards called out to each other and dogs barked. But here, in this secluded villa outside the city walls, the sounds of the world seemed distant and insignificant. On a wide bed, amidst tangled silk sheets, lay a man whose name made half of Europe tremble, and the other half burn with shame. He was only 27 years old. His face, still bearing traces of youthful handsomeness, was now distorted by the imprint of years of excess. Puffy cheeks, bags under his eyes, skin damp with sweat. This was John XII, the vicar of St. Peter, the ruler of Rome, the man who held the keys to the kingdom of heaven in his hands. But at this particular moment, he looked not like a shepherd of nations, but like a frightened boy caught unawares. The door to the chambers burst open with a crash, striking the stone wall. A silhouette appeared in the doorway. It was not a servant with a cup of water, nor a messenger with a dispatch. It was fate itself, in the guise of an enraged husband. A flash, a blow, a sharp pain that pierced the back of his head and instantly spread throughout his body like liquid fire. In an instant, all greatness, all power, all intrigues and plans turned to nothing. The world tilted and began to slowly fade, narrowing to a single pulsating point of pain. Thus, in the bed of another man's wife, far from altars and prayers, began the finale of one of the most incredible and scandalous dramas in the history of Western civilization. To fully understand how and why the head of the Christian world found himself in such inappropriate circumstances in his final hour, we must embark on a journey through time. We must go back to the mid-10th century, to an era that historians would later dub the Dark Ages, or more accurately and mercilessly, the period of pornocracy, the rule of harlots. Rome at that time presented a spectacle both magnificent and pathetic.
It was a ghost city, a skeleton city. Huge skeletons of ancient baths and temples rose above miserable hovels cobbled together from clay and fragments of marble. Columns that once supported the arches of imperial palaces now served as supports for the fortifications of local barons. The Forum, where the fates of the Mediterranean were once decided, was overgrown with grass and had become a pasture for goats and cows, acquiring the humiliating name Cowfield. Aqueducts were destroyed, and life-giving water became a luxury. But despite the outward ruin, Rome remained a symbol. He who ruled Rome held legitimacy. In this chaos, real power belonged not to laws or church canons, but to brute force and family ties. The masters of the city were the powerful clan of the Counts of Tusculum, led by Alberic II. This man, bearing the title of Senator and Prince of all Romans, was the de facto dictator. He ruled the city with an iron fist for over 20 years, turning the papal throne into a kind of family church, completely subservient to the interests of his family. Popes at that time changed with kaleidoscopic speed, often having no time to prove themselves in anything other than obedience to the secular ruler. However, Alberic was not only a cruel tyrant, but also a far-sighted politician. He understood that dual power,
the presence of a secular ruler and a spiritual leader, always carried the threat of conflict. His health was deteriorating, and he thought with anxiety about the future of his dynasty. In 954, feeling his end approaching, Alberic took an unprecedented step. He ordered all Roman nobility and clergy to gather in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter. Under the gloomy vaults, illuminated by thousands of candles, in the presence of the apostles' relics, the dying dictator forced the Romans to take a terrible oath. He demanded that after the death of the reigning Pope Agapetus II, his son and heir, Octavian, be enthroned on the Holy See. This was an unheard-of demand. Octavian was a secular youth, trained for battles and managing estates, not for masses and theological disputes. But the fear of Alberic was so great that no one dared to object. The oath was taken. Soon Alberic left this world, and his son Octavian inherited secular power over Rome. And a year later, in 955, Pope Agapetus died. The Romans, bound by their oath, fulfilled the will of the deceased dictator. Octavian, who was about 18 years old at the time, was elected pope and took the name John XII. For the first time in history, the fullness of power was concentrated in one pair of hands. He was the absolute secular ruler of Rome, and at the same time, the spiritual head of the entire Western Church. This event became fateful. A young man, raised in an atmosphere of permissiveness, suddenly received power unlimited by anything. For him, the papal tiara was not a symbol of service and responsibility, but merely another ornament, granting access to the inexhaustible treasury of the Church. The Lateran Palace, the residence of Peter's successors, was instantly transformed beyond recognition. Strict monks and learned scribes were expelled, and their place was taken by Rome's golden youth, hunters, musicians, and women of dubious reputation. John XII was a passionate hunter. This passion consumed him entirely. Chronicles attest that he could interrupt an important divine service or a reception of foreign ambassadors simply because he was informed that a large deer had been spotted in the surrounding forests. He maintained enormous stables and kennels, spending funds intended for aid to the poor and upkeep of temples on feeding the animals. Bishops arriving in Rome with reports were horrified to discover that the Pope could not be found in the library or chapel. He was always either in the forest with a spear in hand or at the gambling table. Gambling was the young pontiff's second passion. He played dice and cards all night long, losing enormous sums. Contemporaries whispered with shivers that in the heat of the game, when luck turned against him, the Pope invoked not Christ and the saints for help, but pagan gods and demons, Jupiter, Venus, and other idols of antiquity. This was not just blasphemy. It was a direct return to paganism in the very heart of the Christian world. But if it had only been hunting and games, the Lateran Palace had become a place that pious pilgrims began to avoid. Rumors of the morals reigning within the residence's walls spread throughout Europe. It was said that no woman could feel safe in Rome. The palace became the scene for endless feasts, turning into orgies. The Pope generously gifted his favorites, entrusting entire cities and monasteries to their management. Golden chalices, consecrated for the sacrament of the Eucharist, were used for wine libations at banquets. The Romans, who had seen many unworthy rulers in their time, were shocked by the scale of the fall. The clergy were in a state of deep demoralization. How could one preach abstinence and holiness to the flock when the supreme pastor openly trampled all 10 commandments? However, fear of John's military retinue, inherited from his father, kept the city in obedience. Any attempt at criticism was brutally suppressed. Those who displeased disappeared into the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo or were subjected to severe punishments. Nevertheless, the outside world was not about to leave the young rake in peace. Italy, in the mid-10th century, resembled a boiling cauldron. In the north of the peninsula, a dangerous and ambitious enemy was gaining strength, King Berengar II and his son Adalbert. These rulers dreamed of uniting all of Italy under their rule, and Rome, with its rich church lands, was a tempting prize for them. Berengar's troops began a systematic offensive against the Papal States. Cities surrendered one after another, papal garrisons scattered or went over to the enemy. John XII, a brave boar hunter, proved to be an utterly inept military leader. When Berengar's army approached the borders of Lazio, the Pope realized that his accustomed world of pleasures and impunity hung by a thread. He faced not just the loss of power, but also the loss of freedom, and perhaps even his life. The pontificate, which he had perceived as an endless celebration, had turned into a trap. He urgently needed a protector, someone with a sword strong enough to drive the wolves away from the gates of Rome. John's gaze turned north, beyond the snow-capped ridges of the Alps. There, in Germany, ruled King Otto I. He was a personality of a completely different scale and temperament than the Roman pontiff. Otto was a warrior to the core, a man stern, ascetic, and deeply religious. He dreamed of the revival of Charlemagne's empire, of creating a unified Christian state where the emperor's sword would protect the church's cross. For John, Otto was merely a tool, a barbarian with a large army who could be used and then sent packing. In 960, papal legates set off for Germany with a historic offer. John promised Otto what he had dreamed of his entire life: the imperial crown. In exchange, he asked for protection from Berengar and guarantees of the inviolability of the papal territories. Otto accepted the offer without hesitation. He assembled a vast army, consisting of heavy cavalry clad in iron, and marched south. The sight of the German army was so imposing that Berengar's army simply dispersed without engaging in battle. The path to Rome was open. At the end of January 962, Otto I approached the walls of the Eternal City. John met him with ostentatious cordiality, though in his heart, he probably already began to feel apprehension at the sight of this disciplined and powerful force, so different from his own unruly mercenaries. February 2nd, 962, became one of the key dates in world history. A solemn ceremony took place in St. Peter's Basilica. The 25-year-old Pope John XII placed the crown on the head of the 50-year-old Otto the Great. Thus was born the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity destined to exist for almost 1,000 years until the time of Napoleon. At this moment, it seemed that an ideal symphony of powers had been achieved. The spiritual sword in the hands of the Pope and the secular sword in the hands of the Emperor united for the good of the Christian world. After the coronation, the famous document, the __0_ was signed. The Emperor confirmed all land grants made to the Church by his predecessors and guaranteed the protection of papal territories. But to this honey was added a considerable spoonful of tar. Otto included a clause in the document stating that any future pope, before his consecration, must swear an oath of fealty to the emperor in the presence of his envoys. This meant the end of the papacy's independence. The pontiff effectively became a vassal of the emperor. John XII signed this document. He probably reasoned as he always did. Paper will endure anything, Oaths can be broken. The main thing now is for this stern German to leave Rome and continue the war with Berengar in the north. The Pope hoped that as soon as the imperial standards disappeared over the horizon, life would return to its previous course: hunting, feasts, women, and complete freedom. The emperor did indeed leave Rome, heading to Pavia to finish off the remnants of Berengar's troops. And here John made his main mistake. He underestimated Otto. He believed he was dealing with an ordinary feudal lord who could be deceived. But Otto took his role as protector of the church seriously. Feeling the quote zero begin to chafe, John embarked on a most dangerous political game. He began sending secret letters to all the emperor's enemies. He wrote to Berengar's son, Adalbert, offering an alliance against Otto, the very Otto whom he himself had called upon for protection from Berengar. This was a complete U-turn, betrayal in its purest form. But that was not enough. John sent envoys to the Hungarians, pagans who had been ravaging Europe with raids for decades, urging them to attack German lands from the rear. He also sought an alliance with Byzantium. This was hysteria, not diplomacy. John was trying to set the whole world on fire just to get rid of the stern emperor's tutelage. But his secret correspondence was intercepted by Otto's men. When the emperor was read the Pope's letters, he could not believe his ears for a long time. "He is still just a boy," Otto said thoughtfully, trying to find an excuse for the pontiff. "He must have been led astray by bad advisors. We need to be patient." The emperor tried to reason with the Pope by sending envoys to him. But in response, John openly welcomed Adalbert, the emperor's enemy, into Rome and demonstratively began preparing the city for defense. Otto's patience snapped. In the autumn of 963, the imperial army turned around and marched on Rome again. This time, not as protectors, but as judges. John XII, seeing the glint of German armor from the city walls, realized the game was lost. The Romans had no desire to die for their pope's right to hold orgies. The pontiff, taking the church treasury and his closest drinking companions, fled the city, taking refuge in fortified Tivoli. Otto entered Rome without a single shot. The city's inhabitants greeted him as a liberator and immediately took a new oath: never to elect a pope without the emperor's consent. On November 6, 963, an unprecedented trial began in St. Peter's Basilica. The emperor convened a church council to try the Roman pope. This was an event that shook the foundations of the medieval worldview. The vicar of God on earth was judged by men. Archbishops and bishops from Italy, Germany, and France gathered in the cathedral. The emperor himself presided. The pope's chair stood empty, defiantly gaping in the middle of the hall. The hearing of witnesses began, and these were not just dry legal formulations. People who came to the pulpit told things that made the hair of pious prelates stand on end. Bishop Lateran of Cremona, who left us a detailed chronicle of those events, meticulously recorded all the accusations. Witnesses accused John of serving Mass without taking communion, that he ordained a deacon in a stable, among dung and horses, turning the sacrament into a farce, that he sold bishoprics like merchants sell fish in the market. But the most serious accusations concerned his moral character. Specific women's names were mentioned: Rainer's widow, her niece Stephanie, his father's concubine Anna. It was said that he turned the Lateran Palace into a true brothel. He was accused of cruelty, that he ordered his confessor Benedict to be blinded, who soon died, and castrated subdeacon John, which also led to a tragic outcome. And finally, an accusation of magic and idolatry was made.
playing dice with the invocation of Jupiter and Venus. Having heard this list of sins, Otto ordered a letter to be sent to John, calling on him to appear before the council and justify himself. "If you are innocent," the emperor wrote, "come and clear your name." The Pope's response went down in history as an example of arrogance and illiteracy. He wrote a short message in vulgar, broken Latin. "John, Bishop, servant of the servants of God, to all bishops. We have heard that you want to appoint another pope. If you do so, I will excommunicate you in the name of Almighty God, so that you cannot ordain or celebrate Mass." Not a word of justification, not a hint of remorse, only a direct threat. The council took this letter as final proof of John's spiritual unsuitability. "He threatens us like a foolish boy," the bishops said. On December 4th, 963, the council rendered its verdict. John XII was deposed for his crimes and depraved lifestyle. Leo VIII was elected in his place, a respected man, a proto-scriniary, who, however, was a layman. He was hastily put through all the stages of priesthood in one day, which was a violation of canon law, but in that situation seemed the lesser of evils. It seemed order was restored. Otto, confident in the solidity of his success, disbanded part of the army and withdrew from Rome, leaving a small garrison there. But he again underestimated the complexity of Roman politics. As soon as the main body of German troops withdrew, the mood in the city changed. John's agents, generously distributing gold from the stolen treasury, began to incite the people. Romans were instilled with the idea that the emperor had imposed his protégé on them, violating their ancient rights. The feeling of wounded national pride proved stronger than the aversion to John's vices. "Let him be a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch, a Roman, not a German puppet," many reasoned. A rebellion broke out. Leo VIII, barely escaping, fled to the emperor's camp. John XII triumphantly returned to Rome, and it was then that he showed his true face, the face of a vengeful and cruel tyrant. Repressions began, from which the city shuddered. John thirsted for the blood of those who had betrayed him at the council. Cardinal Deacon John, the Pope's namesake, had his right hand cut off. Bishop Augur had his tongue and nose cut off and 2 fingers on his hand severed. These unfortunates were put on public display as a living example of what awaited traitors. On February 26, 964, John convened his own council. In an atmosphere of fear, with armed thugs standing in the temple, the intimidated bishops declared the decisions of the previous synod null and void. All ordinations performed by Leo were annulled. John forced the prelates to repent for daring to judge him. He once again felt himself master of the situation, the victor. But this victory was a Pyrrhic one. Otto the Great, learning of the bloody massacre of his supporters and Leo's flight, fell into an indescribable rage. The emperor swore to crush John. The Germanic war machine once again stirred. The army began to regroup for a final blow against Rome. John's days were numbered, and he could not have failed to understand this. The noose was tightening. And so we come to the finale. May 964. Rome stood frozen, awaiting imperial wrath. Otto's army was camped a few marches from the city. Any sensible ruler in such a situation would pray and prepare defenses, or try to negotiate. But John was true to himself until the end. Danger only spurred his thirst for pleasure, as if he was trying to drink the cup of life to the dregs before it shattered. On one warm May night, the Pope left the safe walls of the Lateran Palace and went outside the city to the vineyard district.
The purpose of his nocturnal excursion was a meeting with a woman. Sources call her Stephanetta, the wife of a respected Roman. Lust drowned out his instinct for self-preservation. What exactly happened in that bedroom, we will never know with complete certainty, but the result is known precisely. In the midst of the, quote, zero, the Pope was struck down. Chroniclers of the time, inclined to see divine intervention in everything, wrote that the devil struck him with a hammer to the temple, claiming his prey. A more realistic version suggests that Stephanetta's husband, who had tracked down the lovers, burst into the room and, in a fit of jealousy, inflicted a severe injury on the pontiff. There is also a medical hypothesis. The body, worn out by alcohol and stress, could not withstand the strain, and a massive stroke occurred. But John did not die instantly. That would have been too easy an end for him. He suffered for another 8 days. 8 days of agony, pain, and fear. And the most terrible thing for a man in his position, he refused to repent. Witnesses claimed that even on the threshold of eternity, he did not summon a priest, did not confess his sins, and did not receive final communion. He left this world as he had lived, boldly, gracelessly, rejecting the very essence of his sacred office. On May 14, 964, the heart of John XII stopped. He was 27 years old. News of his demise spread instantly. The Romans, who had recently supported him against the Germans, felt relief. Emperor Otto, upon learning of what had happened, probably crossed himself. The problem was resolved in the most unexpected way. There was no need to storm Rome, no need to execute the pontiff. Divine judgment came before earthly judgment. John's body was hastily transported to the Lateran Basilica and interred with minimal honors. His pontificate, which lasted almost 9 years, came to an end. But the story did not end. Paradoxically, this man, who became a symbol of the papacy's decline, left behind a legacy that shaped the destiny of Europe for a millennium. It was John XII, guided by momentary gain and fear, who created the Holy Roman Empire. He revived the imperial title in the West, tying the fate of Germany and Italy in an indissoluble knot. This structure, arising from chaos and corruption, would become the core of European politics. Emperors, legitimized by coronation in Rome, would later become the main initiators of church reform. They would fight simony, the depravity of the clergy, bringing order with an iron hand. One could say that John XII, having reached the absolute bottom of moral degradation, created the conditions for pushing off from that bottom. The crisis he embodied became a catalyst for purification. The Church, having passed through the shame of pornocracy, began a slow but steady ascent to the heights of its power in the 11th and 12th centuries. John's story is an eternal reminder of how dangerous it is to mix the spiritual and the earthly. It is a lesson that power without a moral core destroys those who possess it. Octavian, who became John, was a victim of his time and his upbringing. He was a prince forced to play the role of a saint, and he failed in that role with tragic scope. Today, more than 1,000 years later, walking through the ruins of Rome or examining ancient mosaics, we can hear the echo of that era, an era when popes wore armor, emperors wept on their knees, and the fates of the world were decided in mistresses' bedrooms and on battlefields, where prayer mingled with curses. John XII remained in history not as a great shepherd, but as a great lesson, a scar on the body of the Church, which, healing, made it stronger. And this is the main irony of his short, bright, and sinful life. The curtain falls, leaving us alone with reflections on the bizarre paths of history, where even from trash and dirt, magnificent buildings of civilizations sometimes grow. When the young pope's body was lowered into the tomb, Rome sighed. A new era was dawning, an era of struggle between emperors and popes, an era of great reforms and great wars. But the ghost of the boy who only wanted to hunt and drink wine, but was forced to crown emperors, forever remained a shadow over the Vatican, reminding future pontiffs that the tiara is not only power, but also a terrible responsibility before God and people. Such was the finale of the Iron Age of the papacy. History turned a page written in blood and wine to begin writing a new chapter, a chapter of revival and greatness. And although the name of John XII became a byword for all the worst that can be in the Church, without him, there would not be the Europe we know today. The Holy Roman Empire, his involuntary brainchild, stood for 844 years after his death, becoming a monument that outlived its unworthy architect by many centuries.